They denied help to a single mom and an autistic man. But when the world turned away, his quiet stand exposed what compassion truly means. In a town built on judgment, their courage became the proof that kindness can rise even from cruelty. What happened next would challenge everything people thought they knew about weakness, strength, and the cost of being different. The rain came down steady over Ashford, Oregon, a tired little town that had forgotten how to dream. Sarah Mitchell waited outside the bank, one arm shielding her son Marcus from the drizzle, her coat soaked past its seams. Her other hand clutched a folder of papers wet around the edges, proof of everything she had done right, and everything life still said wasn't enough. Marcus rocked gently beside her, whispering numbers under his breath like a spell that kept chaos away. His world made sense in patterns and predictability. Hers didn't anymore, though she tried to pretend otherwise. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and expensive coffee that only successful people seemed to drink without guilt. People walked with confidence, shoes clicking like tiny declarations of belonging. Sarah felt out of place, carrying a purse stitched years ago, and hope that already felt like denial. "I have an appointment with Mr. Davidson," she said softly to the receptionist. The woman's smile faltered for a fraction before returning, smooth but empty. Marcus began flapping his hands. A man across the room frowned, then quickly lowered his eyes, pretending not to notice what made him uncomfortable. The loan officer's office was smaller than she imagined, filled with photos of certainty. Graduations, family trips, sunlight that didn't belong to her world. Mr. Davidson didn't rise to greet her. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, glancing at his monitor instead of her eyes, "we reviewed your file." He talked about policy, risk, and regulation, never about people who broke under the weight of those words. Sarah listened, nodding in practiced politeness, pretending dignity was armor. Beside her, Marcus hummed softly, his rhythm steady against her unraveling calm, unaware that every syllable from the man across the desk carved new bruises inside her. When the man said, "Complicated situation," Sarah heard, "unwanted burden." His polite cruelty burned worse than open insults, because indifference always cuts deeper when it wears a pleasant face. She tried to explain the therapies Marcus attended, the progress charts, the reasons for missed shifts, but he wasn't listening. She could see it in the way his eyes kept flicking toward his phone. Marcus lifted his head, watching the man's mouth move, sensing tension, even if he couldn't name it. Sarah's fingers dug into the loops of her purse until her hand ached, grounding herself in pain because at least that she could control. As they prepared to leave, Marcus broke the silence. "Mama's sad," he said, tone flat but certain, in that innocent, brutal honesty that could still pierce through pretense. The loan officer froze mid-sentence. For half a breath, his professionalism cracked. "I'm just following the rules," he said, his voice defensive now. Sarah gave a tired smile that pretended to agree. "We understand rules," she replied quietly, gathering the wrinkled papers with trembling hands. Rules were what had always kept her just outside safety, close enough to see it, but never to touch. She left before he could reply, her heart beating too loudly. Outside, the sky had turned the color of dull steel. Wind chased torn flyers through empty parking lots, and Sarah guided Marcus down the street. The rejection felt heavier than the debt. It carried shame, the slow poison that coats dignity in silence. Marcus walked in perfect rhythm beside her, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. He whispered, 1, 2, 3, starting over each curb, as if counting could keep their world in order. Sarah watched him, and wondered how a child who needed routine was supposed to survive a life that refused to stay steady for even a single week. Passing a shop window, Marcus stopped suddenly. Inside, clocks ticked in perfect synchronization, covering every wall of the tiny store. Their overlapping sounds created a heartbeat the town had forgotten. "Pretty," he murmured, pressing his small hand against the fogged glass. Sarah smiled faintly, feeling both love and sorrow twist together inside her chest. For Marcus, beauty was logic, gears that never lied, systems that never failed him. She wished life could move like that, precise and reliable, ticking towards something that made sense, not this endless waiting for mercy that never arrived. Then she saw him, the man from the bank's waiting room. He stood across the street under a flickering awning, posture stiff, gaze indirect. His coat was too neat for this side of town, but his stillness carried an unease she recognized. He looked at Marcus, then at her, then quickly looked away. Something about that composure caught her off guard. He wasn't pitying them. He was observing, as if reading a code only he could understand. For a brief second, their shared loneliness reflected back at each other, quiet and complicated. She didn't yet know that moment would matter. At home, the apartment smelled of damp walls, old cooking oil, and fading hope. Sarah dropped Marcus's backpack near the door and stared at the clock blinking 12:00, mocking her with its unchanging rhythm. She counted her last bills, thin paper that dictated everything: food, shelter, the illusion of dignity. Marcus lined his toy cars by color, whispering directions only he understood. She watched his calm, jealous of how closed his world could be, safe behind invisible glass, where nobody could hurt him with opinions or pity. Somewhere inside, guilt twisted like wire around love. After he fell asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table surrounded by envelopes that opened like small wounds. The refrigerator hummed, the only steady thing in the room. She thought of calling someone. Jenny, maybe. But imagined the well-meaning silence that would follow the word, again. The social worker's pamphlet still sat by the sink, promising help for families in transition, a phrase that turned despair into bureaucracy. Sarah traced circles on the table, her mind running loops. Maybe there was still time, maybe not. Maybe she was already invisible. A sound jolted her, a soft scrape, paper sliding under the door. Her stomach clenched. She expected the final notice. Instead, she found a plain envelope with careful handwriting. No name, just one line. Safe place, quiet, no judgment. Call if needed. And a number. Her breath thinned. She opened the door to an empty hallway smelling of rain and distant cigarettes, but no one was there. The note felt alive in her hand, like it carried heartbeat where words should be. The handwriting was neat, exacting, too deliberate to be random. The letter stayed on the table until dawn. Sarah stared at it through the night, reading the same 6 words until they no longer looked real. She wondered if it was kindness or a cruel test from fate. Maybe it came from someone who misunderstood what she needed. Maybe it was the man from the bank. Though why that thought filled her with both dread and strange comfort, she couldn't explain. The steam from her mug had long gone cold, yet she couldn't throw the note away. The offer pressed on her mind like a quiet rhythm she couldn't ignore. Morning light crept through the blinds, thin and gray. Sarah prepared Marcus's small lunch, half a sandwich, 2 apple slices, and the last juice box. At the door she paused, glancing at the folded card still on the counter. Instead of fear, a flicker of curiosity stirred, fragile but real. She tucked it into her pocket, telling herself she'd forget it there. But deep down she knew she wouldn't. Some decisions don't shout, they whisper and wait. She kissed Marcus's head, inhaling the faint scent of shampoo and crayons before stepping into the cold air. At 9, after dropping Marcus off, she finally dialed. The call rang 4 times before a voice answered, measured even, each word spaced like fragile glass. "This is Daniel Chen. You're Sarah Mitchell, from the bank." Her chest tightened. "How do you—" But he interrupted softly, without aggression. "You need help. I have space. 2 rooms. Safe. Quiet. No judgment." The words hung impossible in the air, neither threat nor comfort, just truth stated as fact. Sarah hesitated, pulse roaring in her ears, sensing her life tilt imperceptibly toward something unknown. Silence stretched until it felt tangible. Finally she whispered, "Why would you do this?" The answer came slowly, almost rehearsed, yet painfully real. "Because I know what it's like," he said. When the world decides you're too different to belong anywhere. Then the line clicked dead, leaving only her reflection on the dark screen. Sarah stood frozen, the phone heavy in her palm, realization dawning that whatever had just started would not stop easily. It was as if two lonely frequencies had finally found each other. As she slipped the phone into her pocket, the kitchen clock above her ticked louder than usual, once, then again. An uneven rhythm, slightly off, like time itself had shifted by a single breath. Sarah stared at it, heart pounding, uncertain if it was broken or if something inside her had begun to move for the first time in too long. Have you ever trusted help from someone you hardly knew, simply because it felt meant to be? Tell me down in the comments. I'd love to hear your heart in this one. Daniel Chen's mornings began with silence, the kind that hummed between ticking clocks and the low drone of his own breath. His house, neat to the point of obsession, existed like a living diagram of calmness. Every screw on the shelves faced the same direction. Every window latch he'd checked exactly 3 times before sunrise. To most people, the order would seem strange, but for him it was oxygen. Disorder felt like noise, and noise meant danger. Yet that morning, something disrupted his flawless system. A phone call answered by a trembling voice that sounded both lost and determined. He sat in the kitchen, the receiver still warm in his hand. She called, he whispered to the room, almost questioning it. He hadn't expected her to. People didn't answer kindness. They distrusted it, especially the kind that came without explanation. Daniel placed the phone back with surgical precision, aligning it with the grain of the counter. His heart still fluttered irregularly, a pattern that defied his need for predictability. He should have felt calm, but her voice replayed in loops, soft, hesitant, laced with the exhaustion he recognized too well. He rose and walked through the hallway lined with clocks of every size. Their synchronized ticking grounded him, yet today even the rhythm felt slightly off. He had watched the woman and her boy leave the bank the day before, something pulling at the edges of his logic. He didn't follow people, he avoided them, but he had followed them once, just to make sure they reached home safely. Now that impulse frightened him. He wasn't supposed to care. Caring meant losing control, and nothing terrified him more than losing control of his own patterns. Daniel poured black coffee into the same cup he used every day. Its handle was chipped at the exact curve where his finger fit, familiar as breath. He had lived alone for 15 years in that house at the edge of town, surrounded by mountains and silence. Most neighbors thought he was simply shy. Others whispered stranger things, that the watchmaker had his clocks running on secrets. None knew about the therapies or the years of learning how to mimic normal conversation. They didn't know autism when they saw it. They just called it odd. And Daniel had long stopped correcting them. He sat by the window bench where morning light cut through the blinds like ribbons. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell sounded 9 slow tolls, the same hour Sarah had called. He imagined her fingers hesitating over the keypad, the courage it must have taken to reach out to a man she barely knew. The idea tightened his chest. Empathy was dangerous for him because it slipped through every structured defense. He recalled the look in her son's eyes, the rhythmic rocking that had mirrored his own childhood tremors. 2 reflections of pain learning how to adapt differently. On the table before him lay 2 neatly folded bedsheets and a set of spare keys. He had prepared them the previous night when he wrote the note. He had almost thrown it away 3 times, afraid she would misread the gesture. But a voice from far back in memory had whispered, "Someone once opened a door for you. Do the same, even if no one understands." That voice belonged to the old-school librarian who had first seen beyond his silence, and for the first time in years, Daniel had acted on instinct rather than logic. Now it felt less like kindness, more like fate circling back. He checked the spare bedroom for the 5th time. Fresh linens, curtains drawn halfway to soften the light, a basket with new towels. Too much? Probably. He struggled to decide what enough looked like for normal people. He practiced greetings under his breath. "Welcome. Good morning. You're safe here." Each word felt heavy, rehearsed, like a tool sharpened but never used. Social interaction was a formula he had memorized without emotion. Yet thinking of Sarah and Marcus, he wanted the words to mean something real, though he still didn't know how. Stepping outside, Daniel felt the wind carry the cold smell of rain-soaked pavement. He locked the door, checked the handle twice, then again. Old habits. The walk into town was short, but deliberate. Streets were quiet now, washed clean by last night's storm, but shutters remained closed, as if the town itself preferred not to wake too early. He noticed the cracks on the asphalt forming patterns he silently named safe paths, his brain mapping geometry into comfort. At the bakery, he bought bread and chocolate cookies, uncertain what children liked but willing to try. When he returned home, he rearranged the frame on the wall, an old photograph of his parents, smiling stiffly during a summer decades ago. His mother's voice drifted faintly in memory. "Danny needs time, Harold. The world moves faster than he does." Back then, that sentence had felt like grace. But as an adult, he realized it had also been an invisible wall. Employers didn't have time, friends didn't, society even less. He found space only in solitude, where his patterns ruled. Yet now, for reasons he couldn't name, he wanted to open that space to someone else. That evening, the sky dimmed early, leaking shadows through the lace curtains. Daniel sat at the edge of his bed, heart tapping like one of his clocks out of sync. He imagined knock after knock that never came. He rechecked his phone to make sure he hadn't missed a second call. Nothing. He told himself he didn't care if Sarah never came. It would keep things simple, controlled. But part of him knew he was lying. Control without purpose was just another version of emptiness. Still, he left the porch light on, a signal she would probably never notice. Across town, while Daniel rearranged the same cup again and again, Sarah folded Marcus's drawings into a cardboard box labeled Keep. The two lived parallel lives that night, their thoughts brushing past each other like invisible constellations. Daniel's hands trembled when he rewound his oldest clock, a piece from his father's store, the only one that ever ran backward when wound incorrectly. He lingered on it longer than usual, adjusting each cog. Unseen, he whispered a promise to himself. If she calls again, I won't hide this time. When sleep finally came, it came shallow and restless. His mind replayed fragments, the child's voice, Sarah's shaking breath, the faint smell of rain from the hallway. The loops pulled tighter until he woke before dawn, heart hammering. Something had shifted during the night. The air felt almost charged. He walked to the window and froze. Through the pale fog, two figures stood at his fence, one adult, one smaller. Umbrella tilted, suitcase by her leg, Sarah and Marcus. They had come. Panic collided with relief. He wanted to prepare, to recite the right phrases, but his mind split into noise, too many instructions, too little time. What if she saw how strange he was? What if Marcus did? He turned on the porch light, the warm glow spilling across the pathway, tracing a line between their worlds. Then he opened the door carefully, every motion rehearsed like a fragile experiment that might break if rushed. For a long second, no one spoke. Rain whispered on the steps between them. Sarah's face looked softer than he remembered, yet carved with fatigue. Marcus peered past her leg, eyes darting toward the clocks he could see glowing faintly inside. I didn't know where else to go," Sarah said finally. Daniel nodded, swallowing every practiced phrase. "You came," he replied, the words carrying more surprise than welcome. And just like that, silence became invitation. Inside, as the door clicked shut behind them, all the clocks in the house seemed to tick in new unison, steady, precise, alive. Daniel didn't understand why, but he knew that sound meant something irreversible had just begun. Have you ever met someone and instantly felt your life shift, even before you understood how? Tell me below in the comments. I'm curious if it's ever happened to you. Topic 3. The door that slammed shut. The rain had softened into mist by morning, but the world outside Sarah felt heavier than ever. She sat on the edge of the borrowed bed, listening to the quiet hum of Daniel's house, a rhythm so steady it almost frightened her. No televisions, no traffic, no noise except clocks. The silence should have comforted her, but instead, it made her aware of every thought she tried to avoid. She kept thinking about the eviction notice she hadn't faced yet, the job applications unanswered, and the stranger who had opened his door for her without asking anything in return. Daniel moved around the kitchen downstairs in delicate sound patterns. Mugs touching wood, drawers closing twice, shoes tapping in calculated beats. Every motion sounded purposeful, almost ritualistic. Sarah wondered if he noticed her unease. He seemed to exist inside a different layer of reality, precise where she was scattered. It wasn't threatening, just different enough to remind her she and Marcus were guests in a world built for control. Her instinct told her to feel gratitude, but beneath the surface, she also felt guilt, as though her presence could damage the fragile order he needed. Marcus was already awake, cross-legged on the floor, arranging cups in size order. Sarah smiled faintly. "Careful, honey. Those belong to Mr. Chen." Marcus didn't answer at first. He was lost in the pattern, hands moving in quiet delight. Then he looked up. "He likes patterns too," he said. The sentence startled her not for what he said, but the calm certainty in his tone. Marcus rarely spoke about people, yet he seemed sure of Daniel. She placed her hand on his shoulder and realized he was right. The air of this house did feel aligned with both their hearts in ways words couldn't name. When she came downstairs, Daniel was packing a small paper bag, sandwiches, fruit, 2 chocolate cookies wrapped neatly. "You'll need these," he said without turning. His voice was steady, but she could tell from the rigid posture that conversation cost him effort. "You don't have to," she began, but he interrupted gently. "I want to." Then, quieter, he added, "It makes sense to help." The simplicity of his reasoning disarmed her. No pity, no sympathy speeches, just a statement of logic ironed by kindness. That made it harder not to trust him. Logic felt safe, pity never did. Yet trust always came wrapped in fear. Sarah worried what the world would think. A single mother living in a man's house, a man different from the norm and misunderstood by nearly everyone. She needed money, employment, stability before social workers came again. For now, all she had was temporary peace. So she thanked Daniel, took the bag, and left with Marcus for school. She promised to return later with rent, though she doubted he would accept any. As she walked down the street, fog curled around them like breath from some sleeping animal. Safety had never felt so fragile. At the school office, the administrator forced a smile when Sarah walked in. "You again," the woman said, her tone too bright to hide annoyance. Sarah handed over paperwork proving Marcus's progress in therapy. "He's adapting," she said carefully. The administrator nodded, scanning the documents without reading. "Still, we must consider class compatibility. Some parents have expressed concern." Concern, the polite echo of fear. Sarah clenched her jaw, biting back the same speech she had delivered 100 times. Marcus wasn't dangerous. He was different. But explaining difference to people who equated comfort with sameness was exhausting. Half an hour later, she walked out of the school into cold wind that smelled of diesel and rain. Her hands trembled as she dialed another number. The local bank again. Maybe someone else would listen. She rehearsed her explanation as it rang, but halfway through the call, the clerk interrupted. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you've already been declined." Click. The line went dead. The rejection shouldn't have surprised her, but it carved deeper now that she had seen a glimpse of safety. Losing hope once hurts less than nearly gaining it first. She stood motionless in the drizzle, clutching her useless phone. Meanwhile, at home, Daniel fixed a clock that refused to keep time. Tiny gears scattered across his table like thoughts he couldn't organize. His hands shook slightly, unusual for him. He tried focusing on the mechanism, but every tick reminded him of her absence. People usually left and didn't return. That pattern he understood painfully well. Yet he didn't want this one to repeat. He adjusted the final spring, but the clock's rhythm stayed inconsistent. Too fast, then too soft, as though mimicking his heart. For the first time since his father's death, Daniel wanted something unpredictable to last. When Sarah returned hours later, her hair damp and her shoes muddy, Daniel noticed before she spoke that something had gone wrong. The small tremor at the corner of her mouth betrayed more than words could. He placed 2 mugs of tea on the table, the biscuits beside them aligned perfectly. She sat down slowly, exhaling a breath she didn't know she held. "They denied me again," she whispered. Daniel's reply was almost mathematical. Not everything works the first time. It wasn't comfort in tone, but it strangely worked as one. Predictable failure still felt easier when shared. Marcus slipped into the kitchen quietly, drawn by the rhythmic clink of Daniel's tools. He stood beside his chair, watching the watchmaker's precise movements. Daniel paused, offering a small gear. "Want to see how motion becomes time?" he asked. Marcus nodded, eyes wide with focus. For several minutes no one spoke. The boy and the man existed in silence that made perfect sense to both. Sarah watched them, something thawing inside her. All her life, people had treated Marcus like a problem to fix. Daniel, without trying, treated him like a person to understand. That difference changed everything. Outside, neighbors watched through half-closed curtains, whispers stitching themselves across fences. Ashford was a small town, unforgiving to novelty. A mother and her child taken in by a lonely man who spoke in monotones. It filled the vacuum of boredom with gossip disguised as moral concern. Sarah caught one woman's glance through the window and felt the old sting of shame. She turned away, pretending she hadn't noticed. Daniel hadn't noticed either, or perhaps he had and chosen silence. Either way, the weight of other people's judgment hovered unseen, waiting for its moment to strike. Night came quietly, washing the town in amber streetlights. Marcus fell asleep early, his small body curled beneath the quilt Daniel had ironed flat the day before. Sarah sat by the window, staring at the pattern of raindrops sliding down the glass. Behind her, Daniel brewed tea with movements measured to seconds. "You shouldn't thank me again," he said suddenly, without turning. "Why?" she asked. "Because gratitude changes everything. It makes things unbalanced." She smiled, half sad. For someone who understood mechanisms so well, Daniel still didn't see that kindness balances itself the moment it's accepted. When the knock came, neither of them moved at first. It wasn't loud, just 3 slow knocks echoing through the stillness. Daniel straightened his posture, muscles tightening in reflex. Sarah's eyes darted toward Marcus's room. A part of her knew. Gossip traveled fast. Another part hoped it was nothing, just a late delivery, a mistake. Yet some instincts are older than reason. Daniel walked to the door and pressed his hand against the frame without opening it. "Who is it?" he asked. Silence answered first. Then a calm voice, official and detached. "Social services. We need to speak with Ms. Mitchell." The words seemed to drop the temperature of the entire house. Sarah's breath caught as every clock in the room ticked louder than before. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable, halfway between fear and decision. She rose slowly, her hand trembling, and whispered, "They said next week," but logic no longer mattered. Outside that door stood the part of society that believed it knew what was best for people like her. And people like Marcus. The same system that ignored them until it wanted to control them. Daniel exhaled once, steadying himself. He reached for the doorknob. The latch clicked open, and cold air seeped in, carrying the smell of rain and authority. 2 silhouettes waited on the porch, their umbrellas glistening under the streetlight. The woman in front smiled professionally, clipboard in hand. Her partner adjusted his tie. "We received a report," she said. Those words were ordinary, but they carried ruin dressed as procedure. Sarah's eyes widened. Behind her, Marcus stirred in his sleep. And Daniel, the man who spent his life avoiding confrontation, felt something click inside one of the clocks. Not breaking, but shifting, as if preparing for what came next. The night after social services visited, the house no longer breathed in rhythm. Every clock still ticked, but the pattern felt anxious, as if time itself were holding its breath. Sarah hadn't slept. She sat by Marcus's bed until dawn, watching him dream with one hand in his hair, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The memory of the woman's polite smile haunted her, the kind that meant we've already decided. Daniel stood motionless by the kitchen doorway for hours, replaying each word from the officials, cataloging them like a broken melody he couldn't repair. He had stayed silent through their questioning, because his mind fractured under too many voices at once. They had asked about background checks, safety, his relationship to the boy. Their tones were measured yet sharp around the edges. Sarah had defended him fiercely, her voice trembling but alive. When they finally left, warning of further evaluation, Daniel barely managed to nod. He didn't understand rules made of emotions. He only understood cause and effect. Yet for the first time since childhood, he wanted to bend logic itself, because losing them felt worse than any disorder. Morning light crept over the kitchen counters, cold and quiet. Daniel brewed coffee he didn't drink, counting each spoon of sugar to anchor his thoughts. On the table lay a piece of graph paper filled with diagrams, lines, arrows, boxes connecting ideas only he could interpret. It wasn't a machine this time. It was a plan. His mind translated fear into patterns. Chaos became geometry. Where others saw problems, he built formations. He would fix this, himself, the situation, everything broken by bureaucracy. They measure safety wrong, he murmured. They measure appearances, and that was a metric he could dismantle. Upstairs, Sarah woke to the faint scratching of pencil against paper. For a moment, she thought it was Marcus drawing, but when she looked down the hallway, she found Daniel at the desk, surrounded by notes. His expression was focused, calm in a way that made her nervous. "You should rest," she said softly. He didn't look up. "If we keep still, they'll decide for us. If we move first, they'll need to rethink the pattern." His words were clipped, precise. She wanted to ask what that meant, but something in his tone told her to trust the parts she understood and fear the parts she didn't. Marcus came padding into the room, dragging his blanket like a cape. "Are they coming back?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated and forced a small smile. "Not today." Daniel lifted his head, meeting Marcus's gaze for a full second. Rare for him, but deliberate now. "They won't take you away," he said simply. It sounded less like comfort and more like a statement of design. Marcus seemed to believe him. Sarah wanted to. Yet beneath her gratitude, tension coiled, invisible but electric, waiting for consequence. The question wasn't if Daniel would act. It was how far his pattern would reach. Throughout the day, Daniel moved through the house with purpose. He examined doors, replaced light bulbs, checked mail routes. To anyone watching, it might have looked like over-control, a compulsion taking root. But inside his mind, these actions were equations solving themselves. Security meant data. Predictability meant peace. He measured the distance between front window and mailbox, logging numbers only he could decipher. Sarah watched him quietly, torn between awe and worry. His focus had the purity of devotion, yet behind its calm surface lived urgency sharp as glass. He wasn't merely organizing, he was preparing. In the afternoon, rain returned, drumming soft, irregular patterns on the roof. Daniel stood by the window, staring out at the slow-moving cars, memorizing license plates. Someone new had parked across the street, silver sedan, government plates. His stomach tightened. He didn't ask Sarah to confirm. Some instincts didn't need proof. Instead, he returned to the table, rearranging papers until order returned. "They came early," he muttered. Observation before action. For the first time in years, emotion cracked his voice. Fear of interference, fear of failing the promise he made. "They won't take you away." By evening, Sarah tried to coax him into eating. "You can't protect us if you collapse," she said gently. Daniel blinked, as if the sentence didn't compute. "I don't collapse. I pause," he corrected. She almost laughed at the absurd precision, but behind it was sincerity. He paused, then continued. "You don't understand yet, but patterns don't lie. I've seen this before. Steps they take, questions they repeat. If we anticipate their rhythm, they can't corner us. Sarah's spoon stopped mid-air. She realized he wasn't merely planning defense. He was building a strategy against a system. Night deepened without stars. Marcus slept soundly, his breathing the only steady thing left in the house. Downstairs, Daniel traced lines from memory, government offices, names from documents Sarah had shown him, approval forms, names of board members. For him, it was circuitry, PowerPoints connecting through invisible wires. Somewhere between logic and desperation, the plan transformed into something human, a rebellion in slow motion. But his mind translated rebellion into detail. A letter here, a noise there, subtle manipulations that would eventually draw light on hypocrisy. He didn't want war. He wanted justice measured in proof. Sarah woke near midnight, drawn by the faint light under his door. She knocked once. "Daniel?" Silence then. "Almost done." Her pulse quickened. She entered to find the room full of sketches, diagrams of reputation networks, timelines, connections between city departments. It made no sense to her, but the precision was frighteningly complete. "What are you doing?" she whispered. He turned, eyes strangely calm. "Designing fairness." She swallowed hard. To him, it wasn't arrogance, it was necessity. The same brain that built clocks was now building retribution. Quiet, calculated, almost kind. When morning arrived, Daniel had already left. A note sat on the table in the same tidy handwriting as before. "Don't be afraid if they ask questions today. Just tell the truth. Tell it slowly. I'll manage the rest." Sarah pressed the paper to her chest, confusion mixing with uneasy trust. Outside, the world moved as if nothing had changed. The mail truck humming by, neighbors gossiping over fences. But Daniel was somewhere turning gears not made of metal. And though she couldn't see it yet, something beyond both of them had begun to move. By afternoon, she received the first call, a polite voice requesting an additional meeting at the child welfare office. Sarah's heartbeat stumbled. "We'll review your case," the woman said. A routine follow-up. But behind the politeness, Sarah heard it. Scrutiny sharpened by gossip. She set down the phone and stared at Marcus playing quietly on the carpet. Outside, thunder rolled in distant waves. She didn't know that at that same moment, Daniel was sitting in a municipal building 2 blocks away, watching printers churn out data he wasn't supposed to access. His hands steady, eyes colder than before. Evening fell fast. Rain streaked down the windows, painting stripes of gray across the floor. Sarah set dinner, trying to pretend the day had been ordinary, that Daniel's absence meant nothing. But when Marcus asked, "He'll come back, right?" she couldn't answer. Somewhere in town, one man who preferred invisibility had stepped into the spotlight of a system that despised anomalies. His absence filled the room louder than speech. Every clock kept ticking, yet the time between each second felt stretched thin, suspended right before something irreversible. When the front door finally opened near midnight, Daniel's coat was damp, his eyes unreadable. He said nothing. He simply placed a sealed envelope on the table and nodded toward Sarah. "Tomorrow will be different," he murmured. Then, as if rehearsed, he locked each door twice and turned off every light except one, the small desk lamp glowing over the envelope like a warning beacon. Sarah didn't ask what was inside. She already knew the answer would change everything. By morning, the storm that had carried through the night had faded into a thin drizzle, but the tension still clung to the air inside Daniel's home like static. Sarah awoke to find him already dressed, coat buttoned, shoes lined perfectly beside the door. The envelope from last night remained untouched on the table, heavy with questions she wasn't ready to open. "You should rest," she told him quietly. Daniel shook his head once. "Resting is waiting. Waiting lets them decide first." His eyes were red, not from anger, but from sleepless precision, the kind that came when logic decided something must be done before fear interfered. Sarah wanted to argue, but exhaustion made her voice dull. Marcus stirred on the couch, blinking at the morning light. He still looked peaceful, unaware of approaching uncertainty. Daniel packed a small bag and handed it to her. "Just in case," he said, tone measured. 2 changes of clothes and his drawings. The calm in his voice scared her more than panic could have. "Where are you going?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, choosing his words with surgical care. To align the story before it's told wrong. He left before she could reply, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. The day unfolded slowly like a wound refusing to close. Sarah paced the kitchen, the silence echoing too loudly against her pulse. She made tea she couldn't swallow. On the counter, the envelope tempted her, the fine black ink of Daniel's name almost daring her to know. She resisted until mid-afternoon, then unfolded it, trembling. Inside were pages, printed emails exchanged between city offices, memos about her case, and a summary marked confidential. Her hands shook harder as she read. Someone from the neighborhood had indeed filed a report claiming unsafe living conditions and potential grooming behavior. The cruelty of those words hit her like a physical blow. Tears blurred the text until it became white noise on paper. Somewhere between disbelief and fury, she realized Daniel hadn't been paranoid. He had known. He'd seen the patterns forming before they reached her, just like one of his clocks predicting storm by vibration shift. But where was he now? Somewhere trying to fix this? Or somewhere making everything worse by acting without permission? Her thoughts spiraled, looping on fear. Marcus quietly approached, holding one of his drawings. 3 figures, holding hands under a roof drawn too small to contain them. "It's us," he said. She couldn't bring herself to answer. By late afternoon, the anxiety transformed into motion. Sarah decided to visit the municipal shelter, the place that had once refused them. She told herself it was temporary, that maybe they could register quietly while things settled. The walk through town felt longer than usual. Every step scraped against memories of judgment. People glanced from porches, a few whispered. Small towns stored gossip like currency, and she could feel the cost climbing. Marcus clutched his notebook, humming to himself, his calm the only solid ground she had. As they approached the gray concrete building, she noticed nothing warm about it. No welcome sign, no sense of safety. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with mechanical indifference. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with hair pinned tight, looked up, expression already rehearsed for apology. "We're limited today," she began. Sarah cut her off gently. "I'm not asking for charity, just a place for tonight. My son and I," the woman interrupted, lowering her voice. "Our facility isn't equipped for special care cases. Liability issues." Sarah blinked, stunned by how easily compassion turned procedural. "He's not a case, he's a child," she said, voice cracking. Marcus pressed against her leg, picking up the vibration of distress like sonar. It made him hum louder, seeking pattern in chaos. The woman softened her tone without changing her mind. "You understand, dear. It's not about him personally. We just follow protocol." 2 words that could sanctify any cruelty. Sarah's throat closed, heat rushing behind her eyes. Her instinct screamed to leave, but exhaustion trapped her in place. Another staff member appeared. Security guard, big frame, polite voice masking authority. "Maybe we can arrange something off-site," he offered. The translation was clear. Somewhere else, away from here. She gathered her belongings, holding Marcus's hand tighter. The humiliation burned deeper because she'd expected it, and it still hurt anyway. They stepped back into the drizzle that hadn't stopped. The clouds hung low, smearing gray against the horizon. Marcus sniffled once, then looked up. "We can go home to Daniel now?" he asked, small voice fragile between raindrops. Sarah wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe that word still existed for them, home. But she didn't know what they'd return to, or whether Daniel's plans had changed everything already. "Soon, baby," she whispered. The wind carried her voice away before it reached him, as if even the weather doubted her promise. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in a narrow office across town, staring at a computer screen filled with official forms and internal emails he'd accessed through methods better left unsaid. His pulse beat steady, calm, focused. The words on screen confirmed what he'd suspected. 2 inspectors scheduled to visit Sarah's address again by Friday. The file mentioned unfit guardian due to association. That one phrase electrified him. He copied documents onto a flash drive, methodically deleting traces behind him. Logic supplied no comfort. Morality now dictated his mathematics. People who misused authority needed patterns rewritten, and Daniel Chen rewrote patterns by precision. When he returned home that evening, Sarah and Marcus weren't there. Dusk had fallen, the house dim except for the lingering glow of one lamp. Their absence hit him harder than anger could. Anxiety hummed like static, pushing his breathing into uneven tempo. He walked room to room, counting door frames, chairs, clocks, anchoring himself through numbers. On the table lay the opened envelope. He froze, piece by piece, understanding she had read everything. Relief mixed with dread. At least she knew the truth. But she was gone. Maybe to protect him. Or to protect Marcus from whatever she feared he might do. Hours dragged toward night. Then, faint footsteps sounded outside. He opened the door just as Sarah appeared, drenched, face pale. Marcus yawned sleepily in her arms. "They wouldn't let us in," she said simply. "The shelter." Daniel said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped aside, letting them in. "You're home," he said finally, repeating the word she'd been afraid to use. As the door closed behind them, he locked it twice, out of habit and conviction. Outside, thunder murmured far off, like the world clearing its throat before raising its voice. Inside, 3 souls braced for whatever would follow when morning came. The night pressed close around them. Marcus fell asleep almost instantly on the couch, the rhythm of rain steadying his breath. Sarah tucked a blanket around him and glanced at Daniel, who stood by the window watching the streetlights blink out one by one. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "They'll come again. But this time, we'll be ready." She wanted to ask what ready meant. Instead, she found herself staring at his reflection and wondering whether the man who saved them would protect them or destroy himself. Trying. Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with the pale gray of uncertainty stretching through Daniel's house. Sarah woke to the soft ticking of clocks overlapping like whispers, each beat slightly misaligned, echoing her nervous thoughts. Through the window the sky looked indecisive, neither promising nor threatening, simply waiting. Downstairs, she could hear Daniel pacing in measured intervals. 10 steps forward, pause, 10 steps back. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision until it became unbearable. She went to him and found his hands clasped, knuckles white, as if holding something invisible together. His eyes were distant, fixed on logic only he could see. He didn't greet her with words. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, poured coffee for 2, and placed 1 mug before her with a precision that felt ceremonial. "They'll come today," he said finally, voice even. "Before noon, but I made arrangements." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, arrangements?" Daniel sat down, back perfectly straight. "A friend from a community center, a colleague of my father's. He runs logistics at a shelter out of town, private, quiet, safe. I called him last night. He agreed to take both of you." The calm in his voice was sharper than panic. It meant he'd already decided the conclusion before telling her the premise. Sarah blinked fast, disbelief rising. "You're sending us away?" Daniel shook his head. "Not sending. Moving you out of range." The phrasing unsettled her. It sounded like strategy, not care. "You don't owe us that," she said softly. His response came almost mathematical. "Debt isn't relevant. Safety is." He took something folded from his pocket. Papers, signed and stamped. Travel permission, new address, authorization forms. Every detail aligned cleanly. Sarah realized he must have spent the entire night preparing it all, down to train schedules and a backup plan she couldn't begin to follow. It was overwhelming. The scale of his care disguised as precision. She wanted to protest, to say it wasn't right to let him face this alone. But Marcus appeared at the stairwell, hair messy, clutching his stuffed bear. "We're leaving again?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. That one question decided everything. No matter how hard Sarah fought for pride or logic, the truth was simpler. Her son needed peace more than she needed pride. She nodded slowly. We might, she said. Just somewhere quiet for a bit. Daniel's shoulders loosened slightly, as though her agreement restored equilibrium to a broken equation. Yet beneath his stillness, tension remained, because part of him didn't want them to go. The morning unfolded like a countdown. Sarah packed their few belongings, while Daniel double-checked documents, his movements tight and efficient. On the table, 3 envelopes waited, labeled carefully. One for her, one for authorities, one without a name. The last one is optional, he said when she noticed. It explains what they did wrong. Sometimes facts are louder than defense. His tone made it sound less like hope, more like inevitability. Marcus watched from the hallway, silent but alert, sensing the undercurrent of urgency. He didn't resist packing. He rarely did. Routine change scared him. But today he trusted Daniel's word. That trust scared Sarah most. By late morning, the first sound of tires crunching gravel reached them, the kind of quiet approach made by official cars. Sarah froze, her hand still on the zipper of Marcus's bag. Daniel looked toward the window without moving closer, his breathing slowing deliberately. "They're early," he said simply. 2 silhouettes approached the porch, the same woman with the clipboard, the same rehearsed expression of civility. Sarah's pulse raced. "Please," she whispered. "Don't say anything that makes it worse." Daniel's eyes flickered to her, then to the window. The truth doesn't make things worse. People do. He turned the doorknob before fear could stop him. The social worker began with pleasantries, smiling too broadly. "Mr. Chen, Ms. Mitchell, we just need to verify current living arrangements." Daniel nodded once, wordlessly inviting their inspection. Marcus hid behind Sarah's skirt, muttering numbers under his breath. The woman noticed but misread it as defiance. Her partner scribbled notes already forming a story too clean to be real. "Do you have employment, Ms. Mitchell?" "I'm looking," Sarah answered. "And housing in your name?" Sarah hesitated exactly 1 heartbeat too long. The woman's smile dried. Daniel stepped forward. "They live here under my consent," he said quickly. "It's lawful." That one sentence, lawful, tilted the tone. Lawfulness was rarely welcomed by those who twisted systems for obedience. The questions stretched endlessly. About Marcus's condition, Daniel's background, their relationship. Every phrase implied suspicion masquerading as routine. When the woman finally closed her folder, she thanked them, but avoided Daniel's eyes. "We may follow up next week," she said. Her partner added without looking up. "Pending discretion of evaluation." Then they left, puddle water splashing under impatient steps. The door shut, and the silence that followed felt deafening, like the pause between thunder and lightning. Sarah exhaled shakily. Marcus whispered, "They didn't like us." Daniel, staring at the closed door, replied evenly, "They didn't see us at all." Minutes passed before Sarah realized her hands were trembling. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Instead he turned, straightened 2 picture frames that had shifted during conversation, and faced her. "You should still leave today. They'll return." Sarah nodded weakly, though every part of her rebelled. "And you?" she asked. He hesitated. "I'll adjust variables from here." It sounded cryptic, but that was his language, making emotional dilemmas solvable through structure. She didn't understand the shape of his plan, yet the steadiness in his voice anchored her fear. Trusting him required a kind of faith unrelated to reason, but she had run out of everything else. By noon, the rain returned, fine and cold. The 3 stood in front of the doorway that had carried them through chaos and brief comfort. Daniel handed Sarah a folded paper with an address scrawled in careful print. "If anything changes, go there and wait. I'll find you." His words were factual, void of softness, but his eyes betrayed something unspoken. Care sharpened into vigilance. Marcus slipped his hand into Daniel's. "Will you miss us?" he asked simply. Daniel blinked once, twice, as if processing a question that broke his algorithm. "I don't delete people," he said finally. Marcus smiled, somehow satisfied with that answer. Sarah loaded their small bag into a waiting taxi Daniel had arranged. The driver didn't ask questions. Cash paid for silence. Rain streaked across the windshield as the engine started. Daniel stood at the porch, coat collar turned up against wind, staring not at them, but at the space they left behind. An invisible tether stretched tight between separation and necessity. Sarah wanted to open the window, to thank him, to tell him she'd come back when it was safe. But the words stayed locked in her throat as motion carried them forward, blurring his figure behind water and glass until he was gone. Hours later, that piece of paper with the new address lay in Sarah's lap, edges damp from her grip. She unfolded it for the 10th time. The handwriting was so exact it felt almost inhuman. Straight lines, measured spacing, no hesitation. Something in its precision felt protective, even prophetic. Outside, the landscape shifted from city to empty farmland, colors washing into muted tones. Marcus slept against her side, unaware of the unknowable. Sarah stared out past her reflection into moving rain and whispered to the dark glass, "Please let this be the right thing." The glass whispered nothing back, only the rhythm of wheels against wet rails. At that same moment, miles away, Daniel sat alone at his desk, an open laptop before him. His plan had expanded beyond defense. It was now retaliation through truth. He uploaded evidence files piece by piece, the redacted reports, falsified witness statements, timestamps proving neglect. He didn't care if exposure destroyed his own anonymity. Justice to him was precision correcting imbalance, and once set in motion, precision does not stop for emotion. The last file finished uploading. Outside his window, the town's lights flickered once, like something acknowledging his act before the dark folded it back in silence. The shelter outside Salem sat on a quiet street that smelled of rain-soaked cedar and gasoline. It wasn't new, but it was clean, the kind of place that had learned to survive more through compassion than funding. When Sarah and Marcus stepped out of the taxi, the air felt heavier, as if the clouds themselves were listening. A wooden sign read, "New Haven Community Home." She traced the letters with her eyes while Marcus clung to her coat, overwhelmed by the echo of strangers' voices inside. "It's only for a few days," she whispered, though even she didn't believe the timeline her voice promised. Inside, the space was warmer than she expected. A woman named Gloria, kind eyes, tired smile, led them through narrow halls lined with hand-painted murals of trees and sunlight that looked nothing like Oregon's winter. Marcus paused by one wall, fingers tracing the outlines of painted leaves. Sarah recognized the same fascination he had with Daniel's clocks, the comfort of repeating patterns. "He likes details," she explained automatically. Gloria nodded. "We all do here," she said softly. For the first time in days, Sarah's shoulders dropped an inch, her body remembering what it was like not to brace for attack with every step. When evening came, Marcus settled into their small room, humming to himself while Sarah unpacked what little they owned. She found Daniel's folded paper again, the address written in his tidy print, now creased and almost unreadable from travel. His absence felt strange, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that stayed echoing. She caught herself listening for the sound of steady ticks and could almost hear his clocks. The memory calmed her more than it should have. Marcus looked up suddenly. "Mom," he said, serious. "When he's quiet, he's thinking. Not gone." Sarah froze, realizing her son had understood Daniel more deeply than she had ever tried to. Meanwhile, back in Ashford, Daniel's house felt hollow without them. The rhythm of the clocks, the one thing that had always anchored him, sounded uneven. He moved through the rooms methodically, touching objects to prove they still existed. Every cup, every frame, every habit had lost meaning now that the purpose they had structured around was absent. He told himself this was expected collateral. Systems require silence after disruption. Yet his hands trembled when he passed the couch, where Marcus used to line up his toy cars. On the table still sat one tiny car he hadn't noticed before, bright red among beige surfaces, an unconscious message left behind. Later that night, unable to focus, Daniel turned on his laptop and read local news updates. By now, his uploaded documents had begun to spread, quietly, virally. Headlines remained cautious, but underneath the formality, truths started leaking. Internal corruption in community service funding, inconsistent inspection records, one unnamed whistleblower. He watched the data replication like weather, detached but alert. For anyone else, this might feel like victory. For Daniel, it was only phase 1. Until Sarah and Marcus were safe beyond reach, success didn't compute. Still, a flicker of something resembling calm passed through him when he saw the first journalist use the word injustice without permission. In New Haven, Sarah's phone buzzed under her pillow. The message came from an unfamiliar number. The text was short and clinical. They know about the leak. Be cautious. Her heart thudded once, violently. She sat up, almost waking Marcus. For a long time, she stared at the screen, uncertain if the warning was from Daniel or someone else entirely. The lines between protection and danger blurred until they felt identical. She deleted the message without replying. The act felt both cowardly and necessary. She lay awake until dawn, listening to the sound of rain against the tin roof, imagining it ticking in sync with Daniel's clocks miles away. Days passed in monotone rhythm. Sarah began volunteering in the kitchen to stay busy, her movements deliberate like Daniel's once were. She kept to herself, answering questions briefly, smiling when spoken to but never inviting conversation. People respected her distance, though she saw curiosity behind their politeness. Marcus adapted faster. He drew every day, filling pages with gears, bridges, and intertwined circles that reminded her of clock parts. When asked what it all meant, he answered, "Everything needs a pattern." She didn't argue. Pattern meant predictability. Predictability meant safety, and they both had lived too long without it. What she didn't know was that word had already spread beyond town. Daniel's anonymous leak had exposed enough irregularities to spark investigations statewide. The community service office that targeted Sarah was suddenly the one under inquiry. Anonymous documents signed DC reached journalists, lawyers, even advocacy groups. Yet Daniel didn't bask in righteousness. He barely left the house, afraid to miscalculate one variable. Every act of justice came paired with anxiety, a belief that right outcomes required ongoing maintenance. Justice, after all, was just a machine that could break again if left unsupervised. One evening, while Sarah wiped dishes in the shelter's kitchen, Gloria approached with a newspaper folded beneath her arm. The headline caught her breath. Local officer suspended after corruption leak. She scanned the story, her pulse quickening. It referenced a single unnamed informant connected to recent, incomplete home evaluations. The details were too specific to be coincidence. Gloria noticed the color drain from her face. "You okay, honey?" she asked softly. Sarah forced a nod, folding the paper quickly before Marcus could see. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes the truth takes the long way home," she whispered, mostly to herself. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He tossed, murmuring fragments in his sleep. Sarah sat beside him, stroking his arm until he calmed. Then, from the hallway, a small knock. Gloria stood holding a portable radio. "Reception's clearer by the window," she said, setting it down. "Seems your friend stirred something real. Thought you might want to hear." Static filled the room. Then the voice of a newsreader summarizing the scandal. Funds misplaced, wrongful case closures, officials investigated. Sarah listened quietly, heart clashing between gratitude and fear. If Daniel had done this, he had just pulled the curtain off a system built to bury people like them. Back in Ashford, Daniel sat alone under the same noise, same broadcast, different meaning. He recognized his own phrasing quoted on air, reformatted as public outrage, but the sound hurt, not healed. He traced each clock face, adjusting them to uniform rhythm again, needing something predictable after creating chaos for good. "Order through truth," he murmured, repeating it like a mantra that no longer fit. Through his window, snow began to fall, the first of the season, defying forecasts. He wondered if Sarah and Marcus were seeing it too, at that very moment. The idea kept him still longer than any routine could. 2 days later, a letter arrived for Sarah at the shelter. no return name. Inside was a single piece of paper bearing 3 lines, typed neatly. Investigation resolved. You are clear. Keep moving forward. No signature, but at the bottom right corner was a small ink stain shaped like a gear. She closed her eyes, relief blooming too sudden to feel real. For the first time since meeting Daniel, she didn't cry. She simply breathed. Then, folding the paper carefully, she placed it inside Marcus's sketchbook between 2 drawings. A silent promise to never forget the machine built out of kindness that had saved them both. That night, as the shelter quieted, Marcus whispered sleepily, "Mom, will Daniel come back?" She hesitated, brushing his hair. "Maybe," she said. "But even if he doesn't, he's with us." Marcus nodded as if he already knew, long before she did. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muting the town into stillness. 2 worlds, one made of logic, one of love, had collided not with explosion but with gentleness, rewriting the definition of family in the soft rhythm of falling snow. Somewhere far away, in a silent house filled with clocks, Daniel smiled once, barely, but enough. The first week of relative peace ended abruptly. By Monday afternoon, whispers reached even the quiet halls of New Haven shelter. 2 journalists had shown up earlier, asking about the whistleblower family. Sarah heard the words from the stairwell and felt her chest tighten. It didn't matter that she hadn't spoken to anyone. Association was enough. Marcus was in class coloring geometrical shapes, oblivious. She pressed her hand to the wall to steady herself. Out in the world, Daniel's actions had become fire, righteous to some, dangerous to others, and sparks were now finding their way back to her. There was no safe distance in gratitude that size. By evening, Gloria brought her a warning in the form of weary empathy. "Honey, I don't know what's true," she began, closing the office door. "But authorities are asking questions again. They think you're connected to whoever leaked those documents." Sarah swallowed hard, the truth too fragile to share. She could say nothing that wouldn't risk Daniel further. "And what if I am?" she asked finally. Gloria sighed. "Then you're in more danger than you realize." Sarah's voice steadied. "I'm tired of danger having the final word." Gloria said nothing more. Silence was safer than loyalty when systems started cracking. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Outside, snow melted into rain again, drumming restless patterns on the roof. She stared at her phone screen, tempted to call Daniel, to hear certainty even without comfort. But each potential message dissolved before she could type. What would he say? He wouldn't panic. He'd calculate. He'd remind her that fear was just data before comprehension. The thought almost made her smile. Then the lights flickered. The shelter's old power lines groaned under weather strain, leaving the hallway in dim gray. Somewhere down the corridor, a door slammed. Reality shrank to heartbeat and shadow. Morning brought no relief. A uniformed officer visited the shelter under the banner of routine welfare checks. But Sarah recognized the subtext immediately. A review theater meant to intimidate, not support. She answered questions with careful precision, her mind hovering between truth and protection. Marcus clung to her hand, silent, sensing tension like an approaching storm. The officer's smile was thin as snowpaper. "Rumor says you know things," he prodded. "Rumors louder than evidence," she replied, surprising even herself with the calmness of her tone. When he left, she exhaled slowly, her whole body trembling from restraint. Elsewhere, Daniel listened to the same storm through his window, unaware of how directly it mirrored theirs. News channels debated whether exposing state corruption had endangered vulnerable families. His name wasn't public, but speculation had no mercy. Anonymous digital legends had begun forming around him. Some called him hero, others traitor. To Daniel, these labels meant noise. The only relevant variables were Sarah and Marcus, and their current coordinates hadn't shifted since last night. Yet, a pattern in media coverage unsettled him. One news crew had already traced the story back to New Haven's postal district. His act of protection was collapsing inward. He left his house for the first time in days. The snow had turned slushy, streets glistening under washed-out daylight. He walked with his usual precision, but inside he was chaos disguised as calm. Every step repeated his mantra: fix the variable, restore balance. At the station, he boarded the earliest evening bus heading north. No luggage, only his worn satchel filled with documents and an old pocket watch that once belonged to his father, a device he used not to tell time, but rhythm. As the bus groaned forward, the ticking seemed louder than the engine, marking every hesitation disguised as certainty. Late that evening, Sarah was finishing dishes when the shelter lights blinked again. She sighed. Maintenance issues, she assumed. But then a soft knock echoed on her door. She opened it halfway and nearly dropped the towel in her hands. Daniel stood there. His coat dripped melted snow, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, yet steady as ever. "You shouldn't be here," she breathed. "Neither should you," he answered quietly. "They'll come soon." His tone wasn't fear, only fact. Marcus, hearing his voice, ran forward without hesitation. "You came back," he said, smiling in rare, uninhibited joy. Daniel nodded once, the faintest shadow of relief passing across his features. The reunion, however gentle, had a weight neither of them could ignore. Sarah closed the curtains, heart pounding. "Do you realize what this looks like?" she whispered. Daniel's gaze stayed on Marcus. Truth never looks acceptable while it's still building. He sat down at the small table, pulling papers from his bag. Proof that certain officials had falsified prior reports, signed falsified receipts. He pushed them toward her. "I made copies. If something happens, you'll have evidence." She stared at the files but couldn't touch them. They felt radioactive. "Daniel, you need to disappear, not multiply yourself." He didn't answer. His silence was full of quiet defiance. Minutes stretched thin, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then Marcus broke the tension with simplicity. "We can hide in patterns," he said softly. Sarah turned to him, startled. "What do you mean, honey?" Daniel looked up first, eyes wide as if hearing prophecy. "He's right," Daniel murmured. "Patterns hide better than lies." Sarah shook her head in confusion, but Daniel was already pulling out his old watch, twisting its gears slowly. "Noise keeps predators busy. I'll give them noise." He began explaining his plan in cryptic fragments, emails to decoy accounts, staged correspondence, misdirection through precision. It was brilliance shaped by desperation. Before dawn, Daniel was gone again. He walked into darkness with that same satchel over his shoulder, leaving behind a single folded note for Sarah and Marcus. It contained coordinates, an address 3 towns away, instructions, and at the bottom, his signature initial D. The paper smelled faintly of oil and old metal. Sarah pressed it to her chest, pulse trembling with both dread and hope. She knew this was likely the last time she would see him as he was, a man still half intact. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The storm had begun its second act. When morning rose, so did the headlines. Anonymous leaker identified as local autistic craftsman. The article blurred compassion and suspicion into one cruel paragraph. He was described as brilliant yet unstable, careful yet dangerous. Sarah read every word with tears she refused to wipe away. Public opinion feasted on him before the truth could catch up. "They're turning kindness into threat," she whispered. Marcus looked up from his cereal. "But he was kind." "Yes," she said, voice breaking. "And sometimes that's what frightens them most." That evening, the shelter's television replayed clips of police arriving at an empty house filled with clocks, all perfectly synchronized. The reporter called it obsessive. Sarah knew better. Each tick was Daniel's goodbye, precision as farewell. She muted the screen, pulled Marcus close, and stared through the window at flakes of snow cascading softly over asphalt. Somewhere beyond the noise, she sensed movement, hope buried under accusation, waiting quietly for its chance to emerge clean again. Through fear, fatigue, and love, she whispered into the storm, "They can't criminalize truth forever." The world responded only with ticking. Snow blanketed Ashford in ghostly quiet the morning everything changed. The town's heartbeat slowed, muffled by white, yet under that purity, tension vibrated like an unseen wire. Sarah sat at a bus terminal cafe clutching her phone, replaying the same news clip until the words scraped her ears raw. Daniel Chen, once invisible, now infamous. His face, captured mid-blink as he turned from the reporters, looked less like guilt than bewilderment. The headline under the image read, "The Autistic Whistleblower, Hero or Hazard?" She couldn't stop staring, caught between pride and dread. The world had finally noticed him, but not the truth he'd actually exposed. Meanwhile, Daniel sat confined in a small interrogation room 2 towns away. The walls were colorless, purposefully draining, and the fluorescent hum pierced deeper than questions could. 2 investigators, one impatient, one feigning kindness, took turns framing their language as concern. "You broke into protected networks, Mr. Chen. It's a serious federal offense." He blinked once, internal rhythm steady. "I didn't break anything," he replied. "I fixed a pattern designed to fail." They frowned, threatened by symmetry disguised as defiance. They wanted contrition. He offered precision. Every line of their script assumed regret, yet Daniel's silence unspooled like data refusing to miscalculate itself just to please perception. Back at the shelter, Sarah's phone began ringing non-stop. Journalists hunted connection. Neighbors, both from Ashford and Salem, demanded statements. Every time she answered, her chest burned hotter with frustration, until finally she stopped picking up entirely. She paced near the windows, hands pressed to her temples. "Mommy's thinking," Marcus said softly, sitting cross-legged amid his scattered drawings. He held up one picture. 3 figures under light beams, surrounded by swirling lines of ink that looked like vibrations. "He's making noise," Marcus said, "so people hear right again." His tone was factual, not metaphorical. Sarah realized he saw through confusion the same way Daniel once did. Patterns first, language later. Afternoon news spread like fever. Supporters online called for Daniel's release, labeling him a modern saint for truth engineering. Others called him a threat to stability. Labels wore thin from repetition, erasing complexity. Sarah watched comments scroll by in dizzying waves. "He saved lives. He's unstable. He made us look corrupt." The noise wasn't just public. It was moral static, confusing empathy with convenience. Yet each attack only deepened her resolve. She could no longer hide under uncertainty's cloak. He had stood alone long enough. His isolation had protected them. But now, to protect him back, she would have to step onto the stage she feared most. Public judgment. By dawn the next day, her decision was iron through exhaustion. She would speak. She contacted a local church that had begun hosting town forums on government integrity. The coordinator hesitated, fear disguised as logistics, but eventually agreed. News spread faster than rumor ever could. When Sarah stepped into that hall 2 days later, the crowd surged beyond capacity. Curious onlookers, sympathetic strangers, television crews, skeptics. Ashford hadn't seen such unity since tragedy. She stood behind a wooden lectern so worn its grain felt like skin, her pulse aligning unconsciously with the clicking cameras surrounding her. "You all know his name," she began, voice trembling but unyielding. "Daniel Chen," she said again, slower this time, grounding vowels like anchor points. "You've seen what he did, not who he is. You've read headlines calling him unstable, obsessive, autistic. What they didn't tell you is that he understands injustice the way mathematicians understand equations. Through pattern." Whispered murmurs rippled through the hall. Sarah barely paused. When systems stop protecting people, they stop deserving obedience. Daniel didn't break the law. He exposed the people who twisted it until families disappeared inside its folds. She looked down briefly and saw Marcus in the front row, small hands gripping his bear, watching every syllable as if decoding safety from sound. Reporters captured every flicker of emotion. One shouted, "Are you admitting involvement?" The question sliced the air. Sarah lifted her chin. "I'm admitting gratitude," she said. "If you call compassion criminal, then maybe I am guilty." The crowd erupted. Applause from one side, objections from the other. In those few seconds, polarities reversed. The story stopped belonging to headlines and started belonging to the humans inside it. From somewhere near the exit, a voice called out, "He's listening right now." Cameras turned toward the doorway, but no one stood there, just the static hush of open space. Yet Sarah felt the presence like pressure behind her ribs. That evening in his holding cell, Daniel stared at the ceiling, heartbeat synchronizing with the flickering light overhead. The guard brought dinner but lingered awkwardly. "You're famous," the man muttered. Daniel blinked once. Fame was irrelevant. Fame lacked structure. "People spoke for you," the guard added. "That woman, the mother. She made noise that reached the big offices." For the first time, Daniel's breath faltered. Not at the words woman, not even mother, but at the implicit plural, offices. Chains of authority reacting to one anomaly. He pictured Sarah's face mid-sentence, eyes bright not with fear, but decision. For a man raised to avoid unpredictability, her courage rewrote his algorithm. 2 nights later, the state announced a formal hearing rather than a trial. Public oversight, fairness optics. Daniel's lawyer, a volunteer activist with tired eyes, gestured for calm. "You won," she whispered before entering the crowded chamber. But Daniel didn't understand victory. He only recognized conclusion. When they asked for his testimony, he spoke as he always did. Factual, unembellished, mercilessly honest. "I saw data inconsistent with declared outcomes. People like Sarah Mitchell lost homes because officials redirected aid. Patterns were wrong. I corrected them." The committee shifted uneasily. Ethics wrapped itself in semantics. Yet beyond bureaucratic discomfort, something pure flickered. Respect. Logic, spoken simply, had just humbled deceit. Outside the courthouse, winter sun finally pierced the clouds, dazzling and cruel. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions Sarah barely heard. She kept one hand on Marcus's shoulder, the other gripping the rail to steady the flood of adrenaline. Then she saw him, Daniel, escorted yet unshackled, walking down the steps. Their eyes met for the first time since that final night. No words passed, but something undeniable crossed between them. Acknowledgement that no clock, no force of law, no rumor could rewind what shared truth had built. For him, emotion translated as equilibrium. For her, relief felt like comprehension for the first time in months. Marcus wriggled free from her hand, bolting down the steps before anyone could stop him. "Daniel!" he shouted, voice slicing through microphones and chatter. The boy collided against the man's coat, hugging him fiercely. Cameras froze mid-click. Silence spilled wider than sound could fill. Daniel hesitated, then placed one uncertain hand on the child's head, as if recalibrating the universe's fragile symmetry. "We're balanced now," he murmured so quietly only Marcus heard. Sarah covered her mouth to stifle the sob building behind awe. Around them, strangers watched an impossible sight. Logic embracing love without either collapsing under the weight of the other. Public opinion swung in real time. Within hours, online headlines shifted. From whistleblower to visionary, politicians hedged statements toward recognizing courage. The same news anchors who'd condemned Daniel now called him a misunderstood guardian of truth. The transformation wasn't redemption, it was correction. Society adjusting its tempo after hearing itself against a more honest metronome. Sarah didn't celebrate. She sat on the steps long after cameras dispersed, snow melting slowly around her boots. What she felt wasn't joy. It was stillness, that rare alignment between fate and fairness. The quiet after machinery finally stopped shaking once repaired. That night, the three of them shared dinner in a small restaurant far from the courthouse crowd. Daniel barely ate, his senses overloaded by clinking forks and shifting conversation. But he tolerated it because Marcus laughed, full, bright, free. Sarah watched Daniel struggle with small talk, smiling gently each time silence embarrassed him. "You don't have to be anyone else tonight," she said. He nodded, gaze fixed on the candle's flame. "Patterns can rest," he replied softly. Outside, traffic hummed. a different kind of ticking, and for the first time, none of them felt out of sync with it. When they stepped into the cold afterward, snowflakes drifted under streetlights like slow applause. Daniel looked upward, eyes reflecting brightness instead of algorithms. Sarah tightened Marcus's scarf, whispering, "We did it." Daniel shook his head. "We changed it," he corrected. The difference mattered. Reality hadn't gifted them peace. They had engineered it, piece by fragile piece. And as they walked together through the sleeping town, the whistleblower, the mother, and the child who saw truth in patterns, the night settled into balance, each snowflake falling exactly where it was meant to land. Spring crept into Ashford quietly, almost shy, painting color back into places that had forgotten it. The town that once whispered suspicion now hummed with hesitant relief, learning how to coexist with its own conscience. Newspaper stands still displayed Daniel's name from time to time, but the tones had softened. Innovation from empathy. Clockmaker turned reformer. He neither read them nor denied them. Labels were echoes, and echoes distorted truth. What mattered wasn't titles, it was consistency. And every morning, without fail, Daniel walked to the same corner cafe at 7:43, where a boy waited eagerly for hot chocolate stirred exactly 7 times. Sarah arrived moments later, balancing 2 cups and the rhythm of a life rediscovered. Her eyes, once shadowed by survival, now held the kind of exhaustion that came from rebuilding rather than running. She'd found letters from strangers, parents of autistic children, single mothers, people who saw themselves hidden in her story. Some spoke gratitude, others fear. All carried resonance. She folded each carefully into a box Daniel labeled living patterns. He said someday the box would matter. She believed him. For now, they mattered in smaller circles, in Marcus's laughter, in neighbors offering hellos without judgment, in quiet mornings that didn't hurt to inhabit anymore. Marcus had grown used to the world's attention, or more precisely, to their home's strange normal. He understood news crews might appear occasionally, and he'd learned to wave politely before returning to his puzzles. But his favorite moments remained the ones without lenses. Evenings spent at Daniel's workshop, building tiny wooden clocks that never needed to work exactly right. "Time is forgiving here," Daniel had said once, handing him a small gear he'd carved himself. Marcus smiled, counting its teeth before whispering, "Then people can be too." Daniel hadn't corrected the metaphor. He'd simply nodded, as though truth required no repair when spoken through innocence. Outside that tiny workshop, the town continued to change. The same officials who once doubted Daniel now quoted his reports at ethics conferences. Journalists referenced his case as a cautionary tale, but also sometimes as a miracle. People craved redemption stories. They turned suffering into spectacle disguised as inspiration. Sarah watched this transformation with quiet skepticism. She didn't want them simplified into symbols. Heroism, she knew now, was never romantic. It was repetitive, grounded in endurance. It was Daniel checking locks twice, Marcus practicing social cues, her balancing bills on a table still scarred by spilled coffee and sleepless nights. Real miracles didn't shine. They persisted. One afternoon, while Marcus played outside, Daniel sat by the window tracing light reflections over the floor. "They'll forget soon," he murmured. Sarah looked up from her paperwork. "Maybe that's good," she said. "Forgetting means peace." He shook his head slightly. "Peace means pattern holds steady without observation. Forgetting is decay." She smiled at his precision, the way he dissected hope like a machine but still lived by it unknowingly. "You put the world back together and worry it'll loosen again," she teased. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Because things break," he said. "That's why I stay near." She couldn't argue with that. As weeks turned into months, small traditions formed between them. Sunday breakfasts became sacred, pancakes slightly burnt on one edge, maple syrup measured precisely, but inevitably spilled by Marcus. Friday nights meant card games where Daniel still consulted probability charts, while Marcus laughed at losing streaks. Sarah watched these moments with a bittersweet ache, aware that normality once felt impossible. Their connection defied easy categories, not couple, not friends, not caretaker pair. Something more intricate, a family formed through shared repair. They didn't need blood to belong. They had synchronization born out of chaos that refused to destroy them. In midsummer, Marcus's school organized a community exhibition. Each child presented something representing growth. Some sang, others read poems. Marcus displayed a small clock built entirely from colored clay, imperfect, gears misshapen, hands pointing nowhere. When asked what it represented, he said, "It doesn't tell time, it keeps memories." The crowd laughed gently, touched by his phrasing. Only Daniel understood the deeper resonance. Afterward, as they walked home, Daniel asked quietly, "How did you think of that?" Marcus shrugged. "Because time stopped working when we were sad, and then you fixed it." Sarah nearly cried, hiding it behind a smile, the purest truth wrapped in a child's logic. By late August, the investigation into the corruption scandal officially closed, exposing names and restitution funds. Daniel refused every offer of award or recognition. "System owes, not individuals," he told reporters politely, but firmly. If Eli's courage to speak his truth moved grace, or if you've ever felt invisible in a world that doesn't understand you, after all, the man didn't act for and join our community where every because equations demanded balance. Like this video, if you believe one voice can spark change, invisibility, and share in the comments. At night, have you or someone you love ever been misunderstood for being different? She wished she could convince him your story could give someone else the strength to keep going. Maybe guardianhood itself was the rhythm he'd been built to follow. Autumn brought colors even he couldn't quantify, hues blending logic with emotion. Leaves turned gold, too vibrant to measure. Wind scattered them like unanswered prayers. Daniel found comfort photographing patterns of fallen foliage, cataloging symmetry nature refused to perfect. "Imperfection repeats beautifully," he said once, almost to himself. Sarah stored the phrase in memory like scripture. More than once, she thought about the odds that two broken people could find wholeness in one child's innocent geometry. Life wasn't fair. It was fractal, pieces reconnecting in unexpected configurations that made sense only after distance revealed their design. Months later, on a cloudy December morning, much like the one where everything began, Sarah's old phone buzzed with a message from her former caseworker. The tone was awkwardly apologetic. "Just checking in. I heard how well Marcus is doing. Proud of you all." She read it twice, smiling without bitterness. Forgiveness wasn't obligation, it was release. She typed a simple reply, "We're okay." Truly. Daniel watched her from across the room, tilting his head. "Problem solved?" he asked. "No," she said quietly. "Just closed." He accepted that with a nod, understanding an emotional equation even he couldn't graph. When Christmas arrived, the three of them decorated the workshop tree, small, crooked, perfect. Marcus placed one handmade ornament at the top, a tiny paper clock with no hands, held up by string. "Now it's always now," he declared proudly. Sarah laughed, hugging him. Daniel adjusted the ornament slightly to align its edges, saying nothing. Yet she noticed his lips moving faintly, a rare whisper, almost prayer-like. Now is enough. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as memory, erasing footprints but not meaning. Inside, their quiet laughter replaced the ticking that once ruled Daniel's world, proving not every pattern needs precision to last. Years later, people still talked about the man who changed systems with logic, and the mother who proved compassion could rebuild them. But for those three, life was no longer story material. It was mundane, tender constancy. On early mornings, Sarah still found Daniel adjusting clocks, but now between gestures of warming her coffee before she woke. Marcus, older, still counted when nervous, though less often now, grounding himself through the rhythm of belonging. And as dawn filtered through mismatched curtains, time, once their enemy, became their companion, gentle, measured, and theirs to keep, ticking softly toward everything they'd learned to cherish. Before you go, take a moment to breathe in what this story really represents, the fight of people who are seen but rarely understood. How many Daniels and Sarahs walk past us every day, holding their world together in silence while being judged for not fitting in? If this story touched you, help their voices keep echoing. Click subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Leave your like so more people see this one, and tell me in the comments, have you ever had to rebuild everything when no one believed you could? Your story might be the one that gives someone else hope to keep going.